The Hazelton Correctional Facility sprawled on the outskirts of town like a gray stain amid the rolling Pennsylvania countryside. Built in 1987, the three-story red brick building could hold 280 inmates, although in reality it housed nearly 350. The morning fog of October 2023 enveloped the guard towers as the shift on duty prepared for the start of another day. Tina Collins woke up, as always, 5 minutes before the siren. 8 months of imprisonment had given her a precise internal clock. At 29, she looked younger than her age, slim, with chestnut hair tied back in a ponytail and piercing green eyes that didn't miss a single detail of what was going on around her. Her 9-square-meter cell had become home to another woman, Rosa Mares, a 45-year-old drug addict who spent most of her time in a state of apathy. Tina had learned to appreciate these rare moments of silence before the start of the prison day. On the top shelf above her bunk lay 3 books, a law textbook, a biography of Martin Luther King, and Toni Morrison's novel, Beloved. Tina read them over and over again. Before her arrest, she had worked in an auto parts store, but dealing cocaine seemed like a quicker way to pay off the debts for her sick mother's treatment. 3 years in prison was the price of her choice. At 6:30 a.m., a siren pierced the silence, and the corridors filled with the sounds of the prison awakening. The clang of metal doors, the shuffling of feet, muffled voices, a symphony of imprisonment that Tina knew by heart. "Collins, get up," came the familiar voice of guard Scott Rothman. Tina always noticed that he addressed her by her last name, while he called the other prisoners simply by their numbers. Scott Rothman had been working in the prison for 12 years. At 38, he maintained an athletic physique thanks to the home gym in the basement of his small house on Maple Street. A divorced father of 1 daughter, whom he saw on weekends, he lived the measured life of a single man. Working in the prison was not a calling, but rather a stable income in a city where alternatives were few. Tina noticed that Scott was different from the other guards. He didn't raise his voice unnecessarily, didn't use derogatory nicknames, and always kept his distance, but he wasn't cold. When Tina had a toothache 3 months ago, it was Scott who arranged a visit to the prison dentist without waiting for the standard queue. In the dining room, Tina took her usual seat by the window. The view of the staff parking lot and a patch of autumn forest beyond the fence reminded her of the outside world. Breakfast consisted of oatmeal, toast, and black coffee. Unpalatable, but hot. "Collins is especially dreamy today," smiled Jessica Valentine, an inmate serving time for credit card fraud. At 33, she was the informal leader of the women's block, and her opinion carried weight. "Just thinking," Tina replied, without taking her eyes off the window. "About what? About Prince Charming?" asked Carla Dixon, the youngest in their group, a 22-year-old girl convicted of car theft. Tina smiled but didn't answer. She was indeed thinking, but not about fairy tales. During her 8 months in prison, she had studied the system from the inside, the routines, the weak points, the personalities of the staff. This knowledge could come in handy. After breakfast, the workday began. Tina was assigned to the prison library, a small room with 5,000 worn books. The job of librarian gave her relative freedom of movement within the facility and access to a computer for cataloging. Dr. Emily Chen appeared in the library around 10 in the morning. At 35, she was the only full-time doctor at the correctional facility. She was of Asian descent, of average height, with short black hair and tired eyes behind thin-rimmed glasses. After medical school in Pittsburgh, she could have chosen a more prestigious job, but her student debt and desire to help marginalized populations led her to prison medicine. "I need information on sexually transmitted diseases," Dr. Chen said as she approached the circulation desk. "For an educational program." Tina nodded and headed for the medical section. "Anything specific?" "HIV, hepatitis, syphilis, statistics, prevention methods, modern approaches to treatment." While Tina searched for the right books, Dr. Chen watched her. This prisoner was different from the others, more educated, focused, well-mannered. There was nothing unusual in Tina's medical records except for the standard tests upon admission. "Here's what we have," Tina said, placing 5 books and several medical journals on the table. "If you need anything else, I can request it through interlibrary loan." "Thank you. Are you familiar with medical literature?" "A little. Before my arrest, I helped my mother deal with medical documents. She had cancer." Dr. Chen felt a familiar pang of sympathy. Many prisoners ended up here because of desperate circumstances: illness in the family, loss of a job, drugs as a way to cope with pain. "Did she recover?" "She died a year ago." Tina said it calmly, but Dr. Chen noticed her fingers clenching the edge of the table. At that moment, Scott Rothman entered the library. "Dr. Chen, you're wanted in the medical wing. It's an emergency." The doctor quickly gathered her books. "Collins, can you put these away for me?" "I'll be back later." After the doctor left, Scott lingered at the desk. "How's it going, Collins?" "Fine." Tina looked up at him. "How about you?" Usually, guards did not engage in personal conversations with inmates, but something about Tina's manner encouraged dialogue. She spoke as an equal, without the obsequiousness or aggression typical of the prison environment. "Work is work. I heard your mother was ill." "She was." Tina turned away to her computer. "That's why I'm here." Scott nodded, understanding without explanation. Many prisoners ended up in jail because of attempts to solve family problems in the wrong ways. "Do you miss home?" "There's not much to miss at home, just debts and an empty apartment." There was no self-pity in her voice, just a statement of fact. Scott felt an unexpected desire to continue the conversation, but the bell rang, signaling a change of activity. Lunchtime in prison followed a strict schedule. Captain James Harris personally supervised order in the dining hall. At 50, he was a veteran of both military service and the prison system. Broad-shouldered, with graying hair and piercing eyes, he was respected by both staff and inmates. Harris noticed that in recent weeks, Guard Rothman had been lingering near the library longer than usual. An experienced security chief, he knew that any change in routine could signal trouble. After lunch, Tina returned to the library. Dr. Chen never showed up to pick up the books she had set aside. At 4 o'clock, the workday ended, and the inmates were escorted to their cells for the evening roll call. Scott was on duty until 10 o'clock in the evening. After dinner, there was a period of relative calm. The inmates watched TV in the common areas, read, and wrote letters. Tina usually spent this time reading in her cell. At 9:15 p.m., Scott made his rounds of the block. Tina was sitting on her bunk with a book on law. Rosa was snoring on the bottom bunk. "Getting ready to be a lawyer?" Scott asked quietly, stopping at the cell bars. "Trying to understand how the system works." Tina looked up from her book. "I want to file an appeal." "Do you have grounds?" "Maybe." The court-appointed lawyer wasn't very competent. They spoke in whispers, so as not to wake their cellmate. The hallway was quiet. The other cells had already fallen asleep. "How much longer do you have to serve?" 2 years and 4 months, unless I can get my sentence reduced." Scott nodded and was about to walk away, but then stopped. "Collins, if you need help with legal literature, let me know. The library has access to legal databases." Tina looked at him intently. Such an offer was beyond the scope of a guard's normal duties. "Thank you," she said simply. The night shift started at 10. Scott handed over to his colleague and headed for the exit. A red 2018 Ford pickup truck awaited him in the parking lot, one of the few joys in his measured life. The house on Maple Street greeted him with silence. Divorced for 3 years, Scott still hadn't gotten used to empty evenings. His daughter Madison only came on weekends, filling the house with laughter and music. The rest of the days were quiet. As Scott heated his dinner in the microwave, his thoughts returned to his conversation with Tina Collins. There was something attractive about her, not physically, although she was an attractive woman, but intellectually. She seemed like someone who had been sent to prison by mistake. although Scott knew that such an impression could be deceptive. The correctional facility had strict rules governing communication between staff and inmates. Any relationship beyond the scope of official duties was strictly prohibited and punishable by dismissal. Scott had never broken these rules in his 12 years on the job. But something was changing, and he felt that change every time he saw Tina Collins. Meanwhile, in the women's wing of the prison, Tina lay in the dark, listening to the steady breathing of her cellmate. 8 months had taught her patience and planning. Each day of her imprisonment brought her closer to release, but also opened up new opportunities. Guard Rothman was an interesting man, lonely, conscientious, clearly attached to her more than he should have been. This could be an advantage if she acted carefully and intelligently. Tina had secrets that no one knew about, secrets that could change the lives of many people in this prison. But it was too early to reveal them. She closed her eyes and began to plan for tomorrow. November brought the first frost to Hazelton. Tina watched through the library window as hoarfrost covered the staff parking lot when Scott entered the room. Over the past 3 weeks, their conversations had become longer and more personal. "I brought you this," he said, placing a new criminal law textbook on the table. "I ordered it through the supply service." Tina raised her eyebrows in surprise. "That's an expensive edition. How did you get it?" "I said it was for the inmate education program." Scott avoided her gaze. "The administration supports rehabilitation through education." She opened the book and saw the publication date on the title page, 2023, the latest legal changes and precedents. A textbook like this cost at least $200. "Thank you," she said quietly. "This means a lot to me." When their eyes met, Scott felt a familiar thrill. In 12 years on the job, he had seen hundreds of inmates, but none had evoked such feelings. Tina was special, smart, reserved, with a dignity that prison had not broken. "Maybe you could help me figure out some of the topics," she suggested. "I mean, purely for educational purposes." Scott knew he was crossing a dangerous line. Personal conversations with inmates outside of work requirements violated protocol, but he nodded. From that day on, their meetings became regular. Every evening after the main meal, when there were no other inmates in the library, Scott found a reason to go there. Officially, he was checking on order, but in reality, he was spending time with Tina. She told him about her life before prison, about her mother, who had battled cancer for 3 years, about her job at an auto shop, where her salary was barely enough to pay the rent, about how dealing drugs seemed like the only way to pay for chemotherapy. "I'm not justifying my choice," she said one evening, sitting at the library table. But at the time it seemed like there was no other way. Scott listened, sitting on the edge of the table, another violation of the rule requiring physical distancing. "And now? Do you regret it?" "The drugs, yes. Trying to save my mother, never." Her honesty struck him. Most inmates either denied their guilt or blamed circumstances. Tina took responsibility, but retained her human dignity. Scott also began to open up. He talked about his divorce, which happened not because of infidelity or arguments, but because of emotional detachment. He talked about his daughter Madison, whom he only saw on weekends. He talked about how working in prison had gradually made him cynical and lonely. "Why don't you try to find another job?" Tina asked. "There aren't many options in our town. The prison, the coal mine, a few factories. I chose the safest one." "Safe," she repeated with a smile. An interesting word to describe working in a prison. By December, their relationship had crossed a new boundary. It happened on a Friday night when Scott was on night duty. Making his last rounds before the shift change, he stopped at Tina's cell. Rosa was asleep, snoring on the bottom bunk. "Can't sleep?" he whispered. "I guess," Tina replied, sitting on her bunk in her prison uniform. "About what?" "About you." Those two words hung in the air between them. Scott felt his heartbeat quicken. He knew he should walk away, continue his rounds, forget about this conversation. Instead, He moved closer to the bars. "Tina, I know this is wrong," she interrupted. "And I know you're risking your job, but I can't stop thinking about our conversations." Scott looked down the hallway. It was empty. The other inmates were asleep, and his colleagues were on other floors. He took out his keys and unlocked the cell. Tina got up from her bunk. They stood facing each other in the cramped space of the cell, and Scott could smell her hair. Simple prison shampoo, but it seemed special on her. "This is crazy," he whispered. "Yes," she agreed, and stepped closer. Their first kiss was cautious, almost innocent, but the emotions that had been building for weeks exploded. Scott held her, feeling the warmth of her body through her thin prison uniform. "We can't," he said, but he didn't pull away. "I know," she replied, but kissed him again. From that evening on, their relationship became physical. Scott found ways to be alone with her, during night shifts, in the library after work, in the infirmary, where he sometimes accompanied prisoners. Each meeting was brief and cautious, but their intimacy deepened. Tina turned out to be a tender and passionate lover. She understood his need for quiet after long days in the noisy prison and knew how to listen to his worries about his daughter and ex-wife. For the first time in years, Scott felt an emotional connection with a woman. "What will happen when you get out?" he asked her one day as they lay side by side on a narrow cot in the medical unit's utility room. "I don't know," Tina replied honestly. "I still have 2 years to go." "I could wait." She turned to face him. "Scott, you can't build your life around a prisoner. You have a daughter, a career." "A career as a prison guard?" He smiled. "Not very impressive." "You're a good man. You deserve happiness." But even as she said this, Tina moved closer to him. Scott didn't know her secrets, didn't suspect her hidden motives. To him, she was the woman who made him feel alive again. Captain Harris began to notice changes in the behavior of guard Rothman. Scott started staying late after his shifts, checking the library and medical ward more often, and looking distracted during staff meetings. The experienced security chief knew the signs of trouble among the staff. "Rothman, come to my office," he said after the morning shift in mid-December. Scott entered the captain's office, trying to appear calm. Harris pointed to a chair across from his desk. "How are you? Everything okay?" "Yes, sir. Why?" "I've noticed you've been staying late after your shifts. Overtime will be paid, but it needs to be officially recorded. Just making sure everything is locked up and in order." Harris looked closely at his subordinate. "Scott, we've known each other for many years. If you have any problems, personal or work-related, you can speak openly." "Everything is fine, Captain." "Good, but remember, there's no room for distractions in our work. Prisoners know how to find weaknesses in the staff and exploit them." Scott nodded, feeling his cheeks flush. Harris suspected something, but he didn't have any proof yet. In January 2024, scheduled medical examinations of the staff began. Dr. Chen conducted examinations and took tests from all employees of the institution. It was an annual procedure, mandatory for prison system employees. Scott came in for his examination on Tuesday morning. Dr. Chen performed a standard examination. She measured his blood pressure, checked his reflexes, and listened to his heart and lungs. "When was your last blood test?" she asked as she prepared the syringe. "A year ago during the last examination." "Are you feeling normal? Fatigue, fever, any symptoms?" Scott thought about it. He had indeed been feeling tired in recent weeks, but he attributed it to the stress of his secret relationship with Tina. "I get tired sometimes, but that's normal for our job." Dr. Chen took blood for a standard set of tests, a complete blood count, biochemistry, and tests for infectious diseases. Among them was an HIV test, which was mandatory for all staff at the facility. "The results will be ready in a week," she said, sealing the blood vial. Scott nodded and left for his shift. He didn't think about the tests. Medical examinations were routine, and he had always been healthy. The week passed quickly. Scott continued to see Tina, and their relationship grew deeper. He began to make plans for the future, imagining how they could be together after her release. On Friday morning, Dr. Chen received Scott Rothman's test results. At first, she couldn't believe her eyes. The HIV test was positive. She double-checked the data and made sure there was no mistake in the sample labeling. The result was clear. Scott Rothman was HIV positive. Dr. Chen felt a chill of horror. Scott had been working in the prison for 12 years and had never had any health problems. HIV infection meant contact with an infected person in recent months. She took out the medical records of all the prisoners and began to study the records. Which of the prisoners was HIV infected? How could Scott have come into contact with them? Upon admission, all inmates underwent mandatory testing for infectious diseases. Dr. Chen found several positive HIV results, but most of these inmates were housed in the men's block. Scott worked primarily with women. Among the women, there was one positive HIV test. Dr. Chen opened the corresponding file and saw the name Tina Collins. The test upon admission 8 months ago was positive for HIV. According to protocol, Tina was supposed to receive antiretroviral therapy and undergo regular follow-up tests. Dr. Chen checked the records, the treatment was being administered, and the viral load was under control. But how could Scott have been infected by an inmate? Professional contact with safety precautions in place could not have led to transmission of the infection. The only way to contract HIV is through unprotected sexual contact or contact with blood. Dr. Chen felt nauseous. If her suspicions were correct, then the guard and the inmate had been intimate. This was not only a violation of protocol, but also a crime. She closed the medical records and tried to calm down. She had to think about her next steps. First, she had to tell Scott about the test results, then conduct additional tests to confirm the diagnosis. And then she would have to decide whether to report her suspicions to the administration. Tina was working with new book arrivals in the library when she noticed Dr. Chen hurrying toward the administration building through the window. The doctor's expression was anxious. Tina felt a slight uneasiness. During her months of intimacy with Scott, she had always been careful, but the risk of exposure was ever present. Medical examinations of staff were particularly dangerous. She had known about her HIV status since her arrest. She also knew that she had not told Scott about it. Every time they were intimate, he was exposed to a risk he was unaware of. For Tina, it was part of a bigger plan, a plan that began with the emotional attachment of a lonely guard and could end with his complete submission to her will. Monday, January 29, 2024, began as a normal workday for Scott Rothman. He didn't know that in a few hours, his life would change forever. At 10:30 a.m., an internal call came over the intercom. "Guard Rothman, please proceed to the medical wing for a conversation with Dr. Chen." Scott didn't think much of it. Perhaps he needed to escort one of the inmates or discuss medical issues. He headed for the medical department, located on the second floor of the administration building. Dr. Chen met him at the door of her office. Her expression was serious, almost mournful. "Scott, come in. We need to talk in private." She closed the door and pointed to a chair across from her desk. Scott sat down, feeling a growing sense of unease. "Your test results are in, Doctor." Chen began, holding a medical folder in her hands. "Unfortunately, there's a problem." "What kind of problem?" Dr. Chen took a deep breath. "The HIV test came back positive." The words hung in the air. Scott looked at her, not understanding what she was saying. "What do you mean?" "You are infected with the human immunodeficiency virus. I double-checked the tests. The result is reliable." Scott's world collapsed. HIV, a deadly infection. How is this possible? He had always been careful, never used drugs, never had casual sex. "This is a mistake," he croaked. "There must be a mistake." "I'm afraid not. Scott, we need to discuss possible sources of infection. When was the last time you had unprotected sex?" The question struck him like a bolt of lightning. "Tina. Their meetings in the infirmary, the library, her cell, months of unprotected intimacy. "Doctor," he said slowly, "are inmates tested for HIV upon admission?" Emily Chen looked at him intently. "Yes, it's mandatory. Scott, if you had contact with an infected inmate, that's a serious breach of protocol." "Which inmates in the women's block are HIV positive?" Dr. Chen hesitated. Disclosing medical information violated confidentiality, but the situation was critical. "Tina Collins," she said quietly. Scott felt the blood drain from his face. Tina knew. She knew about her infection and didn't tell him. Months of intimacy, declarations of love, plans for the future. It was all a lie. "How much time do I have left?" "Scott, HIV infection is not a death sentence now. With the right treatment, people live full lives, but you need to start therapy immediately." He could barely hear her words. His mind was spinning with thoughts of Tina, of their last meeting 2 days ago, when she lay in his arms and whispered how much she missed him. "Scott, there's one more question. I am required to report a possible breach of protocol to the administration, intimate relations between staff and inmates." "Give me some time," he interrupted. "Please, I need to think about everything." Dr. Chen nodded. "You have 24 hours. Then I'll have to write a report." Scott stood up on shaky legs and headed for the exit. In the hallway, he stopped and leaned against the wall. HIV, betrayal, the end of his career. What would his daughter say? His ex-wife? He spent the whole day in a daze, mechanically performing his duties. His colleagues didn't notice his state of mind. Scott had always been a reserved person. In the evening, while the prisoners were having dinner, he headed to the library. Tina was there, working on the catalog on the computer. When she saw him, she smiled, a warm, loving smile that now seemed to him like a disgusting mask. "Hi," she said. "How are you? You look tired." Scott closed the library door and turned the key. Tina raised her eyebrows in surprise. "We need to talk." His voice sounded hoarse. "About what?" But he saw wariness in her eyes. "About HIV." Tina froze. They looked at each other in silence for a few seconds. Then she slowly turned away to the computer. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't lie to me!" Scott exploded. "Don't you dare lie to me again. I got the test results today. I'm infected. And Dr. Chen said you're a carrier too." Tina closed her eyes. When she opened them, her expression had changed. The softness and vulnerability he loved so much was gone. What remained was cold calculation. "So what now?" "You knew," he said. It was not a question, but a statement. "You knew all this time and kept quiet." "Yes," she said simply. The answer struck him with its directness. He had expected denial, tears, attempts to explain, but not this calm admission. "Why?" he whispered. "Why didn't you tell me?" Tina got up from the table and walked over to the window. "What would have changed? Would you have stopped seeing me?" "Of course. I would never have risked it." "Exactly," she interrupted. "And I needed this relationship." "Needed? For what?" She turned to him. There was no remorse or shame in her eyes. "To survive in this place. Do you think life in prison is easy? The warden's patronage opens doors and gives privileges." Scott felt rage rising in his chest. "So it was all a sham? Our conversations, our intimacy, your words of love?" "Not everything," she shrugged. "You're a nice person, Scott. Under different circumstances, maybe." "Shut up," he growled, clenching his fists. "Just shut up." Tina saw his rage, and for the first time in the conversation, showed caution. She backed away toward the wall. "Scott, I understand that you're angry." "Angry?" He laughed hysterically. "I'm not angry, Tina. I'm destroyed. You destroyed my life. My career is over, my health is ruined, my future is destroyed. And all for your convenience in prison? Listen," she tried to speak in a soothing tone. "HIV isn't a death sentence anymore. With treatment." "Don't you dare!" He shouted so loudly that she flinched. "Don't you dare talk to me about treatment! You knowingly infected me with a deadly disease." "It's not a deadly disease," Tina objected, "and I didn't force you to have sex without a condom." That argument finished him off. Scott stepped toward her, and Tina pressed herself against the wall. For the first time since they had been together, she saw a real menace in his eyes. "Are you accusing me?" he whispered, coming close to her. "Should I have guessed that the woman I love is a cold-blooded psychopath?" "Scott, get away from me." "Or what? Call security? Tell them how I violated protocol?" Tina realized she had gone too far. Scott was beside himself with rage, and she couldn't predict his actions. "I didn't mean to hurt you," she tried to soften her tone. "I just wanted to survive. At my expense. At the expense of my life." He turned away from her and headed for the door. He stopped at the exit. "It's over between us. Stay away from me. And pray that I don't lose control completely." After he left, Tina sank into a chair. Her hands were shaking. For the first time in months, she felt real fear. Scott was a kind, gentle man, but what she had seen in his eyes a minute ago had nothing to do with kindness. She had underestimated the strength of his feelings for her. She had underestimated the destructive power of betrayal. Now, instead of an ally, she had a mortal enemy with access to her cell. The next day, the atmosphere in the prison changed. Scott avoided the women's block, handing over his duties to his colleagues. When their paths did cross, he looked at Tina with such hatred that the other inmates began to notice the tension. "What's going on between you and Warden Rothman? He looks at you like he wants to kill you." "No idea," Tina lied. "Maybe he has problems at home." But she felt hostility, not only from Scott. Captain Harris also looked at her with suspicion. Apparently, rumors of the conflict had reached management. On Tuesday, Captain Harris called Scott into his office. "Sit down," he said without preamble. "I've been told about your strange behavior. What's going on?" "Nothing special." "Scott, don't lie to me. You're avoiding the women's block, your colleagues say you look sick, and there are rumors of a conflict with inmate Collins." At the mention of Tina's name, Scott's face contorted into a grimace of hatred. "There is no conflict." "Then explain why you look at her as if she were your personal enemy." Scott remained silent. Telling the truth would mean confessing to a crime and losing not only his job, but also his freedom. "Harris, I have personal problems. It has nothing to do with work." The captain studied his subordinate's face intently. "Personal problems should not affect the performance of your duties. If you can't handle it, you'd better take some time off." "No need. I can handle it." "I hope so, because any violations of protocol regarding prisoners will result in immediate dismissal. Am I clear?" "Yes, sir." After leaving the office, Scott realized that time was running out. Dr. Chen promised to keep quiet for 24 hours, but 3 days had already passed. Soon the truth would come out. He would be arrested and sent to the same prison where he worked. And Tina would go unpunished. She would serve her sentence and be released, while his life would be ruined forever. The thought was unbearable. On Wednesday evening, while making his final rounds, Scott stopped at Tina's cell. Her cellmate was asleep, but Tina was sitting on her bunk with a book. When she saw him, she tensed up. "What do you want?" she asked quietly. "To talk." "We have nothing to talk about." Scott looked down the hallway. It was empty. He took out his keys and opened the cell. "I said we have nothing to talk about," Tina repeated, but there was fear in her voice. "On the contrary, we have things to discuss." He entered the cell and closed the door behind him. "For example, what will happen when I get arrested?" Tina put down her book. "Scott, I wasn't going to—" "Shut up and listen," he interrupted. "Tomorrow or the day after, Dr. Chen will file a report. I'll be arrested for coercing a prisoner into sex. Do you know what I'm facing?" She was silent. 5 to 15 years in prison. And do you know where I'll be held? In a prison for former police officers and prison guards. They have a special attitude toward people like me there. Scott, you ruined my life for your own convenience. And now you'll get victim status. You'll tell them how the evil guard forced you to have sex. Maybe they'll even reduce your sentence for cooperating with the investigation. There was such hatred in his voice that Tina instinctively backed away. I won't say anything. You will, because it's in your best interest, and I'll go to prison as a rapist and die in 6 months from beatings or a knife. It's not my fault, she snapped. You made your own choice. Choice? He exploded. What choice? To love a woman who lied to me every day? Their voices grew louder. Rosa stirred on the lower bunk. You could have used protection, Tina hissed. You could have followed the rules. And you could have not been a lying bitch. Rosa woke up from the shouting. What's going on here? Scott and Tina froze, staring at each other. The moment had been lost. Scott turned and left the cell, slamming the door behind him. Nothing, Tina said to her neighbor. Just a routine check. But they both knew that was a lie, and that what was going on between the guard and the prisoner was far from over. Left alone, Tina realized she was in mortal danger. Scott was teetering on the brink of insanity, and his hatred for her was growing every day. Sooner or later, he would snap. Thursday, February 1st, 2024, 5:47 a.m. Guard Mark Johnson was making his morning rounds of the women's block before his shift change. The hallway was quiet, as it usually was in the early morning. The prisoners were still asleep, with 40 minutes to go before wake-up. Approaching cell 247, where Tina Collins and Rosa Mares were being held, Johnson noticed something was wrong. Rosa was sitting on the lower bunk, rocking back and forth, her lips moving silently. Mares, what's going on? He asked quietly. Rose looked up at him with wild eyes. She's not breathing, the woman whispered. She hasn't been breathing for several hours. Johnson looked at the top bunk. Tina lay motionless, facing the wall, the blanket covering her up to her chin. At first glance, she appeared to be fast asleep. Collins, he called out. There was no response. Collins, wake up, he repeated louder. Tina didn't move. Johnson opened the cell and approached the bunk. When he touched Tina's shoulder, his fingers met a cold, stiff body. Damn it, he cursed, and immediately radioed Captain Harris. At 6:15 a.m., the area around cell 247 was cordoned off. The paramedics who arrived pronounced her dead, estimating the time of death to be 2 to 3 hours ago. Tina Collins' body was lying on its side, facing the wall with no visible signs of a struggle. Captain Harris personally supervised the preservation of the scene until the police arrived. According to protocol, any death in a correctional facility must be immediately reported to external law enforcement agencies. Detective Michael Torres received the call at 6:45 a.m. At 42, he was the lead homicide investigator in Luzerne County and had a reputation as a meticulous, methodical professional. After his divorce 2 years ago, his work became his only anchor, although it could not completely stifle his penchant for alcohol. Torres arrived at the correctional facility at 7:30 a.m. Captain Harris met him at the main entrance. "What do we have?" the detective asked, pulling out his notebook. An inmate was found dead in her cell around 6 this morning. Tina Collins, 29, was serving time for drug trafficking. Her cellmate says she noticed something was wrong during the night, but didn't dare raise the alarm. Cause of death? Preliminary findings indicate strangulation. No visible injuries, but the medical examiner hasn't completed the full examination yet. Torres nodded. Who had access to the cell? Technically, all the staff on duty, but according to the log, the last check of the block was at 11:15 p.m. It was conducted by guard Rothman. I want to talk to her cellmate and this Rothman guy. Harris led the detective to cell 247. The body had already been taken to the morgue, but the room remained untouched. Torres carefully examined the small space. The top bunk was neatly made. Tina's personal belongings, a few books, a tube of toothpaste, a comb, were neatly arranged on a shelf. There were no signs of a struggle or coercion. Strange, Torres muttered. It looks like she went to bed and just didn't wake up. Rose Mares was temporarily transferred to the holding cell for questioning. The 45-year-old woman was in a state of shock, shaking, stumbling over her words, repeating the same thing over and over. "Tell me what happened last night," Torres asked gently. "I don't know. I was asleep and then I woke up, maybe at 3 in the morning, and felt that something was wrong." "What exactly?" "It was too quiet. Tina always tossed and turned in her sleep, sometimes talking. But now there was complete silence." "Did you check on her?" Rosa shook her head. "I was afraid. I thought maybe she was just sleeping soundly. But in the morning, when I realized she wasn't breathing..." "Did you hear anything unusual that evening? Voices, footsteps, sounds of a struggle?" "No. It was a normal evening. Tina was reading until lights out, and I was watching TV in the common room." "How long had you known Tina?" 8 months since she got here. She was a good girl, smart, well-mannered, never caused any trouble." "Did she have any enemies among the inmates?" "No. Everyone loved her. She helped with legal issues, wrote letters for those who couldn't." "And among the staff? Any conflicts with the guards?" Rosa hesitated. "I don't know. She'd been kind of nervous the last few days, and Guard Rothman was looking at her strangely." "How strangely?" "Angrily, somehow, as if she'd done something bad to him." Torres wrote down this information. After questioning Rosa, he asked Captain Harris to arrange a meeting with Rothman. Scott was in the staff lounge when he was called in for a chat with the detective. He had hardly slept in the past few days. His face was gaunt, his eyes red. He greeted the news of Tina's death with visible relief, which did not escape the attention of his colleagues. "Guard Rothman?" Torres pointed to a chair opposite him in the captain's office. "Detective Torres, I'm investigating the death of Tina Collins." "Yes, a tragic story," Scott replied, trying to control his voice. "I understand you made your last rounds of the women's block last night?" "That's right, at 11:15 p.m. as usual." "Did you go into Collins' cell?" Scott hesitated for a second. "Yes, standard check." "How did the inmate appear?" "Normal, getting ready for bed." "Did you speak with her?" "Minimally. I asked if everything was okay. She said yes." Torres took notes. "Your colleagues mentioned some kind of conflict between you and Collins. Can you comment on that?" Scott's face tensed. "There was no conflict." "Then why does her cellmate say you looked at the prisoner with hostility?" "I have no idea. Maybe she misunderstood something." Torres studied Scott's reaction closely. The man was clearly nervous, avoiding direct eye contact, his hands shaking. "How long did you know Collins?" 8 months since she arrived." "Were there any special interactions?" "She worked in the library. Sometimes I had to deal with organizational issues." "For example?" Scott didn't answer right away. "Ordering literature, technical support." "I see. Where were you between midnight and 3 in the morning?" "At home. My shift ended at 10 and I left immediately." "Can anyone confirm that?" "I live alone, but my neighbors could have seen my car in the driveway." After talking to Scott, Torres asked Captain Harris to show him the surveillance camera footage. The video surveillance system covered the corridors and common areas, but did not enter the rooms for privacy reasons. The recording showed Scott making his usual evening rounds. At 11:12 p.m., he approached room 247 and opened the door. The image showed only his back as he entered the room. 4 minutes later, he came out and continued down the hallway. "That's quite a long time for a standard check," Torres remarked. "Yes," Harris agreed. "It usually takes about 30 seconds. "Are there recordings from other cameras? The parking lot, for example?" Harris showed the recordings from the outdoor cameras. Scott did indeed leave the premises at 10:45 p.m., but 2.5 hours later, his pickup truck reappeared in the parking lot. The time on the recording was 1:23 a.m. Interesting, the detective muttered. He said he went straight home. Scott returned to the building through the service entrance, to which he had a key as a senior guard. The recordings showed him walking straight to the women's block. 40 minutes later, he left the prison again. "Do we have a motive?" Torres asked the captain. "Not yet, but Rothman had been acting strangely the last few days. He avoided the women's wing and looked ill. We need to talk to the prison doctor. She may know more." Dr. Emily Chen agreed to meet with the detective in her office. She looked exhausted. The news of Tina's death had shaken her. "Doctor, I'm investigating the death of Tina Collins. I need your help in understanding the circumstances." "Of course. How can I help?" "Did you know the inmate personally?" "Yes. She sometimes came to borrow medical literature for the library. She was a smart girl." "Did she have any health problems?" Dr. Chen hesitated. Medical confidentiality prohibited the disclosure of medical information, but murder changed the situation. "She was HIV positive. She was receiving appropriate therapy." "HIV?" Torres looked up from his notebook. "Who else knew about this?" "Only the medical staff. It's confidential information." "What about the regular staff?" Dr. Chen took a deep breath. "Detective, there's something I need to tell you. A few days ago, during a routine examination, I discovered that guard Rothman was HIV positive." Torres froze. "Go on." "The only possible source of infection in our facility is Tina Collins. That means they had an intimate relationship." "Did you report this to the administration?" "I was going to, but now the girl is dead." Torres put down his pen. The picture was starting to become clear. A forbidden relationship, HIV infection, rage over betrayal, a classic pattern for a murder motivated by jealousy and revenge. "When did you tell Rothman about the diagnosis?" "On Monday morning." "And Collins died on Thursday. Enough time for the rage to mature." After talking to Dr. Chen, Torres had a clear picture of what had happened. Guard Scott Rothman had entered into a forbidden relationship with an inmate, contracted HIV from her, and upon learning the truth, killed her in a fit of rage. All that remained was to gather enough evidence to press charges. That evening, Scott sat at home, trying to make sense of what had happened. Tina was dead. His torment was over, but his problems were just beginning. The detective clearly suspected something and was asking too many questions about his relationship with the victim. Sooner or later, the truth would come out. His HIV status, their forbidden relationship, the motive for murder, everything pointed to him. All he could do was wait to be arrested. Strangely, he felt no remorse. Tina got what she deserved. She played with his life and lost. The only thing that bothered him was how to explain it all to his daughter. At midnight, Scott drank his last glass of whiskey and went to bed. Tomorrow would be a new day, perhaps the last day of his freedom. At the county police station, Detective Torres worked late, studying the evidence that had been gathered. He had a motive, opportunity, and circumstantial evidence. All that remained was to obtain an arrest warrant and conduct a final interrogation of the suspect. The Tina Collins murder case was close to being solved. Friday, February 2nd, 6 a.m. Detective Torres received the arrest warrant at dawn on Friday. The Luzerne County judge found the evidence presented sufficient to charge Scott with first-degree murder. At 7:30 a.m., police cars surrounded Scott's house on Maple Street. Torres personally led the arrest operation. Scott did not resist. He opened the door before the police even had a chance to knock. "Scott Rothman, you are under arrest on suspicion of the murder of Tina Collins," the detective said as he handcuffed him. "I knew you were coming," Scott said quietly. "I've been packing all night." A search of the house uncovered medical records, confirming an HIV diagnosis, and a letter to his daughter in which Scott explained his actions. In the letter, he called Tina a cold-blooded killer who, got what she deserved. At the police station, Torres began questioning him at 10 a.m. Scott refused a lawyer, saying he was ready to tell the whole truth. "Start with how you met Tina Collins," the detective suggested. Scott described how they gradually grew closer, how their friendly conversations developed into a romantic relationship. He described Tina as an intelligent, charming woman who made him feel alive again. "When did the relationship become physical?" "In December. I knew I was breaking the rules, but I couldn't stop. She was special." "Tell me about how you found out about the HIV." Scott's voice became harder. "Dr. Chen told me on Monday. At first, I didn't believe it. Then I realized where it could have come from." "What did Tina say when you asked her?" "She confessed without hesitation. She said she knew from the beginning, but she needed our relationship to survive in prison." Scott described their final confrontation, the rage of realizing the extent of the betrayal, the understanding that his life was ruined. "What happened on the night of the murder?" Scott was silent for a few minutes. "I couldn't sleep. I lay at home thinking about what she had done to me, about how I would soon be arrested, put in jail, and she would go unpunished." "And you decided to go back to prison?" "I didn't decide. I just got in the car and drove there. I wanted to talk to her one more time, to try to understand how someone could be so cruel." "But you didn't get to talk to her?" "No." Scott shook his head. "When I entered the cell, she was asleep. She looked so peaceful, so innocent. And I thought about how this person had deliberately infected me with a deadly disease." "What happened next?" "I woke her up. She was frightened when she saw me. She said she would scream if I didn't leave. And then I couldn't take it anymore." Torres waited patiently for him to continue. "She tried to get up from the bed, but I grabbed her by the throat. I didn't want to kill her. I just wanted her to shut up. But my hands tightened on their own, and I couldn't stop." "How long did it last?" "I don't know. A minute, maybe 2. When I let go, she was dead." "What did you do after that?" "I laid her on the bunk and covered her with a blanket. I tried to make it look natural. My roommate was sleeping on the lower bunk and didn't notice anything." "Why didn't you call for help?" Scott smiled bitterly. "Help who? The woman who ruined my life, or myself?" It was too late for everyone. The autopsy results, received a day later, confirmed Scott's testimony. Tina died of asphyxiation due to compression of the neck. Fingerprints matching those of the suspect were found on her throat. There were no other injuries. Captain Harris filed a report on serious security breaches at the facility. The administration launched an internal investigation, reviewing protocols for staff interaction with inmates. 12 years of impeccable service, he said to Dr. Chen over a cup of coffee in her office. "How could I not have noticed what was going on?" "No one is to blame," Emily replied. "Scott was good at hiding the relationship. Even I only found out the truth from the test results. We should have known sooner. It's our job to prevent situations like this." Dr. Chen was tormented by her own doubts. Should she have immediately informed the administration about Scott's HIV status? Could she have saved Tina by violating doctor-patient confidentiality? "I gave him time to think about the situation," she admitted. "I thought he would confess on his own." He did confess, but only after the murder. At the trial, which took place 4 months later, Scott Rothman pleaded guilty to all charges. His lawyer tried to get a lighter sentence, citing his client's emotional distress upon learning of his HIV infection. The prosecutor insisted on life imprisonment, calling the murder a cold-blooded act of revenge. Dr. Chen, Captain Harris, and Rosa Mares, who never recovered from the shock of the experience, testified as witnesses. The defendant abused his position, the prosecutor said in his closing statement. He entered into an illegal relationship with a prisoner, and when confronted with the consequences of his choice, he killed a defenseless woman. The defense argued that Tina was a manipulator who deliberately infected an innocent man with a deadly disease. "My client is the victim of a calculating criminal," said the lawyer. He acted in the heat of the moment when he learned of the betrayal. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. The verdict: guilty of second-degree murder. The judge sentenced Scott to 25 years in prison without the possibility of parole. Scott remained calm as the sentence was handed down. "I do not apologize for my actions," he said. "Tina Collins got what she deserved. It's just a shame the price was too high for everyone." Detective Torres was present at the sentencing. After the trial, he approached Dr. Chen on the steps of the courthouse. "A fair sentence," he said. "Fair?" She shook her head. 2 lives destroyed, families in mourning. Where's the justice in that? In the fact that the killer will be punished. What about Scott's daughter? She lost her father. What about Tina's mother? She lost her only child. Torres had no answer. In his work, justice was measured in arrests and convictions. Human pain was more difficult to heal. A year later, Hazelton Correctional Facility got a new chief of security. Captain Harris resigned, unable to withstand the moral pressure. He moved on to work for a private security firm, far away from places of confinement. Dr. Chen continued to work as a prison doctor, but changed her approach to confidentiality. Now, she immediately reported any suspicions of inappropriate relationships between staff and inmates to the administration. Rosa Mares was transferred to solitary confinement at her own request. She suffered from post-traumatic stress and regularly visited the prison psychologist. Her sentence expired after 8 months, but her rehabilitation continued for a long time. Scott's daughter, 14-year-old Madison, moved to live with her grandmother in another state. Her classmates found out about her father's crime, and the girl had to change schools. She refused to visit her father in prison, telling her mother, "I don't have a father anymore." Tina Collins' grave in the city cemetery was modest, a simple gray stone with her name and dates. Her mother, who had been living out her last months after a recurrence of cancer, died 6 months after her daughter. Tina had no friends or distant relatives left. Detective Torres sometimes visited the grave. He couldn't explain why he did it. Perhaps he felt guilty for not being able to prevent the tragedy. Or maybe he was trying to understand how an intelligent, educated woman could make a choice that led to her death. The story of Tina Collins and Scott Rothman became a cautionary tale in the Pennsylvania correctional system. Control measures were tightened, additional psychological testing of staff was introduced, and protocols for interacting with prisoners were revised. But behind the dry reports and new rules, the main truth was lost: that people remain human even in the most extreme circumstances, with all their passions, weaknesses, and capacity for self-destruction. Prison walls can hold bodies, but they cannot contain human nature in all its dark complexity.